Remember this.
What we can do is try to prevent inflation becoming more ingrained in the system.
You're trying to get into people's heads and ask them not to ask for too high pay rises.
Well, broadly, yes. I will say that, in the sense of saying we do need to see moderation of wage rises. Now, that's painful. I don't want to, in any sense, sugar that message. It is painful. But we need to see that in order to get through this problem more quickly.
That was Andrew Bailey, Governor of the Bank of England, speaking in February last year. To fight inflation, he said, ordinary people would have to refrain from asking for pay increases, even if it was painful. Now let's fast forward to February this year, where Chancellor Jeremy Hunt delivered this message.
The bank is very clear that wage pressure is one of the risks that could cause inflation to stay around for longer than we want. We will talk to the unions about absolutely anything except things that will mean that high inflation is entrenched for longer, because that is the stealth tax that is causing people's salaries to be eroded. It's causing a huge amount of anger and distress, and we want to get it out of our system as quickly as we can.
That's right, the government would talk to the unions about anything other than inflation-busting pay rises. In other words, workers would need to take a pay cut. That was the starting position. That was unconditional. Finally, let's go right to the top. This was Rishi Sunak speaking this summer.
There is no point, Laura, in me doing something that sounds popular and nice today. For example, on public sector pay, I would be giving with one hand and we would just be taking with the other through higher inflation and interest rates. That's not the right type of leadership that the country needs, and that's not what I'm going to do.
Andrew Bailey, Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak did all get their way. Public and private sector wages have fallen in real terms by record amounts, and according to the OBR, the real household disposable income per person in this country is on course to fall by a cumulative 5.7% between 2022 and 2024. It's been grim for almost everyone, and it continues to be. I say almost everyone, though, because some in our society have still been raking it in, namely Britain's biggest bosses. The High Pay Centre has revealed that bosses at Britain's biggest firms received an average 16% pay rise in 2022. By studying company accounts, they found the median pay of a FTSE 100 chief executive to be £3.91 million in 2022, up from £3.38 million in 2021. It means the average earnings of a FTSE 100 boss is now 118 times more than a typical UK worker. Incredibly rank, despicable. On Good Morning Britain, Owen Jones explained why.
Nurses are £5,000 on average in real terms poorer than they were in 2010. The paramedics are £6,500 poorer than they were back in 2010. Workers overall, private, public, have gone through the longest squeeze in wages now since the Napoleonic age. In fact, it's estimated in 2026, the average British worker will be no better off than they were back in 2008. And at the same time, bosses are paying themselves massive, massive wages.
An average £500,000 per head.
Well, and you know what? This comes back to the issue of inflation. Who is causing inflation in this country? Because if you look at the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, they bring together all the rich industrialised countries, the research points to the fact that a lot of companies are using this to fuel massive profits that are driving inflation. It's not wages, because we've gone through such a squeeze in wages now. The idea that ordinary people paying too much money in shops is driving inflation just is incredible. But we've got to look at the top. We've got to look at behaviour.
We look at the top, and what do we then do? Because, of course, people can rail about the unfairness, they can be bitter. But apart from say, please share that around,
tax them.
You practice?
Tax them properly.
Andrew, what's the details like on it?
Listen, I'm not going to advocate wage controls, because that's the root of madness. But it's ridiculous. While they're telling people further down the food chain, you will take 4 or 5% when inflation is still nearly 7%. It ain't right.
I'm beginning to think that the cost of living crisis is a little bit similar to the carbon footprint, a concept created by the capitalist class to let itself off the hook. We are not living through a cost of living crisis. We're living through a cost of capitalism crisis. I don't know how many times it needs saying the rich have got richer during COVID. The rich have got richer during the cost of living crisis. The Ukraine war, which contracted the energy supply, was massively capitalized on by energy companies to the extent that CEO of BP called his company a cash machine. They're laughing at us. They're laughing in our faces. And we're there being like, it's really tough that we're all in this together. I guess Captain Tom should do another lap round the block in heaven or whatever. We are not living through a cost of living crisis. The rich are getting richer. The capitalist class uses moments like this, moments of economic instability, moments of social insecurity, to stuff their pockets. We know this. Naomi Klein wrote about it in The Shock Doctrine. It's a well-established theory. But yet we've somehow internalized in a really earnest way that, we've all got to pull up our socks and sort of get on with it. It reminds me of the health and social care levy that the government introduced towards the end of the pandemic to help pay the costs of the pandemic. Some of those costs, of course, being the massive hundreds of millions of pounds worth of contracts that they awarded to their mates that they met down the pub for PPE that literally is still probably sitting in warehouses somewhere today. That tax was, like many of the taxes in this country, massively regressive. And so the point that Owen makes towards the end, how do you solve this? Tax the rich, is so commonsensical. We live in a country where you are taxed more for the money that you earn by the sweat of your brow than the money that mysteriously lands in your Coutts bank account at the end of the month. Capital gains tax is, for the most part, less of a tax on people's income than income tax. It's totally common sense now that this would be the case. But in previous eras, the idea of taxing profits in times of crisis was also common sense. You look at the end of the First World War, Britain introduced an excess profits tax, similar to a windfall tax, taxing the companies that had made loads of money off of the war, munitions companies, for example. Why has it now become the case that 60 years later, something like an excess profits tax, which, by the way, accounted for a third of the revenue Britain took in during that post-war period, is now totally unthinkable? We've been had as a society by people like the governor of the Bank of England, people like the CEO of Shell, who tell us that we're all in this together, when no, we're just in this. They're not giving with one hand and taking with the other. They're just taking with both hands.